Thank you, Bill. You're too kind. Thank you for having me back here. This is an organization that I admire and respect, and which does great things for Kentucky. The organizers of this event obviously face somewhat of a scheduling dilemma. They could either put me before lunch and have you lose your appetites, or put me right after lunch and have you lose your lunch. And I think they've chosen well. My assigned topic was a new agenda for Kentucky, a different perspective, which is a tactful way of saying a new agenda for Kentucky, an arrogant jerk's perspective, or a new agenda for Kentucky. Here's what certainly won't happen. So, given that the new agenda for Kentucky is a distinctly future-oriented document, and you seek a different perspective from me, I decided to give you a perspective from the past. We Kentuckians love the past, so much so, in fact, that we went there to get our current governor. But more about that later. Upon mentioning the past, most speakers, or better make that all speakers, feel obliged to offer up that overused quotation from the philosopher George Santayana that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. He's right, of course, especially in Kentucky, but more about that later too. Because I happen to love poetry, however, as well as philosophy, instead of using Santayana's maxim as the scriptural text for today's political sermon, let us read instead from the French poet Paul Valéry, who said, "The trouble with our times is that the future is not what it used to be." Indeed, this sort of sums up the impact of the economic collapse that has befallen our state, our nation, and the world since the Kentucky Chamber launched the New Agenda Initiative in 2007. In many ways, and despite your best and admirably diligent efforts, achieving the goals you've set for Kentucky's future is now even more difficult than it was before. But I promised you some time travel, and I'm tarrying too long in the present. So let's throw it into reverse and journey back exactly a century to 1910, when our beautiful state capitol building was brand new and the progressive impulse was in full flower. But in Kentucky, as elsewhere, was facing some fierce resistance from some entrenched interests. To me, at least, the Kentuckians of 100 years ago seemed pretty darn smart. Consider, for example, the qualifications of the man they chose to be governor. He was a Republican, born in a small eastern Kentucky town, who headed off to Harvard for an education. He returned to the Commonwealth to practice law in Louisville. Historian James C. Cotter described him as a well-read man who liked poetry, and noted that he had held no major elective or appointed office before becoming governor. What a wonderful biography. That governor was Augustus E. Wilson. And with amazing prescience and anticipating you by a century, he and the Democratic-controlled General Assembly made some pretty good progress toward each of your new agenda's 5 goals to transform Kentucky. Want to improve the educational attainment level of Kentuckians? They passed an education reform law that established a high school in every county, strengthened school attendance requirements, appropriated more money to the State University in Lexington, and put it under a bipartisan board. Want to modernize government at all levels? They reformed the juvenile justice system, created a Bureau of Vital Statistics, and established a motor vehicle registration and licensing law. Want to promote wellness and healthy Kentuckians? They strengthened child labor laws, passed a Pure Food and Drug Act, and outlawed abortion. Want to prepare Kentucky to successfully compete in the global marketplace? They used the militia to end the Night Rider violence of the Black Patch War so that the tobacco industry could flourish. They abolished bookmaking on horse races, which was then largely being done in pool halls, and thus set the stage for the passage of pari-mutuel wagering and the flourishing of the horse industry. Want to expand Kentucky's role as an energy leader? They strengthened the state's mine inspection law. So, with all due affection and respect for the Kentucky Chamber, both of which are considerable, your new agenda is not really so new. Your goals are pretty much the same as those that the leaders of this Commonwealth were pursuing a century ago. Even many of the issues are identical. The problem, the reason why Kentucky still lags behind in so many areas a century later, is not with the agenda or the goals, but with the politics, the people, and the pace of progress and reform. Our old friend, the poet Valerie, put it this way in words that apply with particular force to Kentucky. Politics is the art of preventing people from taking part in affairs which properly concern them. Kentucky has tried just about everything politically during the past century. Democrats dominated the politics for 100 years. A Democratic governor directing Democratic majorities in both chambers of the General Assembly has been the norm. There have been a few Republican governors. The last one enjoyed, although he might not put it quite that way, a Republican state Senate. The result, after partisan warfare of a sort not seen since Goebel at the turn of the century, was that voters went rushing backwards to find the most conventional, old-fashioned, and unimaginative Democrat that they could find. Republicans have never held the governorship in both legislative chambers, and perhaps that's at least one try in over a century. But the prospect of a Republican House in the short-term future is something that I just don't see. So we seem destined for more decades of divided government. That can be a blessing in Washington, but it's become a curse in Frankfurt. Maybe more prosperous states can afford the kind of partisanship that destroys governorships, repeatedly blocks the passage of prudent budgets, and leaves us at the wrong end of almost every ranking of the states. We cannot. Yes, there have been spasms of progress under politicians of both parties, but in the big picture, things have been too bad, too long for Kentucky, and positive social change has come too slowly in this Commonwealth. Keeping up with other states is simply not good enough for Kentucky, and neither is slow and steady progress. So, turning your goals into reality requires more dramatic and rapid change than our current politics is capable of providing. This is not about policy. As for that, you've already collected a great many ideas as part of your new agenda initiative. But progress toward implementing them will be painfully slow if pursued via conventional politics. To accelerate the pace toward a better future, compelling leaders have to advance and pursue these ideas in ways never before seen or tried in this state. During this economic crisis, which is the most ominous of our lifetime, Kentucky needs a new politics. So the different perspective which I present to you, prudent, responsible, and serious business leaders, is that the time has come to get a little bit radical. Here are a few ideas for doing so. Run your own independent or third-party candidates, or at least threaten to do so. In the 1920s, a bipartisan combine of urban bosses and wealthy bluegrass farmers, in other words, your predecessors, backed like-minded candidates in both parties to protect railroad, coal, liquor, and racing interests. You, the quintessential insiders, need to create a credible prospect of going outside the system. Will you win? Of course not. But just as diplomacy must be backed by a credible threat of force in order to be effective, your lobbying must be backed by a credible threat of going outside the system and taking your money there too. Second, create alternative media. To paraphrase the very wise Lowell Reese, imagine what Kentucky might be like if the dominant editorial voice over the past century had been the Wall Street Journal editorial page instead of the Courier-Journal editorial page. As far as major media opinion makers are concerned, Kentucky more or less has the Paxton Papers of Paducah, some smaller specialty publications, and my every other week column on one side, and the Courier-Journal, the Herald-Leader, and everybody else on the other. Now, some say that's a fair fight, if not a little bit in our favor.